This particular presentation forms a handshake with last week's. Last week, beginning with history, I talked about Thucydides. We're using Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War, because it's the first really great, complete history in this particular planetary civilization. Before Thucydides, there were king lists for thousands of years. There were chronicles. There were mythic cycles. There were many kinds of records. There were archives. The Chinese Shu Qing, or Book of History, is an account of the Shang dynasty, which lasted between 1750 and about 1100 BC. But the Confucian classic, the Shu Qing, is not really a history. It's again a kind of a chronicle. It's a recording of anecdotes, of specialities, of what the kings may have done in their particular time. This is not a history. The first really great Chinese history occurs about 100 BC, more than 300 years after Thucydides, the great Chinese historian Sima Qian, who entitled his work, and in translation it would be Records of the Grand Historian. Thucydides is the first history, and we begin with him because he establishes a form, a conscious form. And this conscious form does not work only or particularly in an integral way. It doesn't bring material together so much as it collects material in order to reflect a broadening message, a broadening meaning, so that a history is a differential form. It is not meant to collect the actions of the rich and famous, of the kings, of the royalty, and list them, or even just list them in some chronological order. That is not history at all. With Thucydides, we come to understand for the very first time that a history has a theme, and that this theme must be followed with great discipline, and it has an exact beginning. It has a development which reaches an end, so that historical forms have a beginning and an end, a history. In a very real way, the literary form which most is a precursor of history is Greek tragedy. A Greek tragedy has its beginning, and all of the developments lead towards a conclusive end, called in Greek denouement. So that a history has family resemblance to a tragedy, a classical tragedy. Thucydides' history, which takes the theme of the Peloponnesian War and develops it from the beginnings of the war to the end of the war. And this war lasted for more than a generation and changed the course of the world. Thucydides tells us at the beginning of his history that understanding human nature, understanding in a conscious way what is beginning to transpire, that he is going to keep track of the entire event firsthand. Now, in Thucydides, we saw that a history which has a theme, that has a definite beginning, a genesis point, although the term genesis has mythic connotations, and it develops to a conclusive end. It is characterized by a dynamic between two kinds of power. Two kinds of power. And in Thucydides, there are two Greek words which translate as power. One of them is energeia, from which we get the English term energy. The other is dynamis, from which we get the English term dynamic. Thucydides says that dynamis is a force which happens from events. That events have a push. They have a current. And that the ongoingness of events creates a dynamic. And that this dynamic is a force to be contended with. And that consciousness, when consciousness participates as a dimension in the world, the dynamis that was once nicely folded into myth is released and overruns the banks of the traditional instinctual story forms. The river of dynamis overflows the banks of myth, and in doing so, threatens to flood the life of human beings. So that in order to deal with this flood of force, which the historical dynamis of events makes as a challenge for us, another factor, another quality needs to be taken into consideration. The other factor is the other kind of power. That's the power of energeia, energy. And that energy comes from people, from characters, from individuals. So that to Thucydides, the two kinds of power that weave together to make the fabric of the energy, dynamis, the force, the interplay, the power of history, is a weaving together of individuals and events. That is to say, they must be taken together at all times in order to accurately keep track of what is happening, what is going on. And in a way, we talked last week about the pairing of events with individuals. This event is characterized by this person, this event by that person, these events by these people. And by keeping the individuals close to the events, the sequencing of events is no longer mere chronology. The sequencing of events has the dimension of personality factored into the ongoing course and development. So that the theme of a history, first enunciated by Thucydides, a theme is the weaving of individuals and events into this synthesized picture which is ongoing, and that this picture is woven of energy and of dynamic, but the energy and dynamic has a specific form. It's not a natural force which has no beginning and no ending, is always ongoing. It is instead a conscious form which always has a beginning and an end. The litmus test of a conscious form is that it has an alpha and an omega. One of the apocryphal stories of the of the recalcitrant young Jesus. One of the stories about Jesus when he was 5 years old, when he was not paying attention in school. And the teacher rapped his knuckles because he couldn't say his Hebrew ABCs. And the apocryphal story has the 5-year-old Jesus saying, if you can tell me exactly what beta is following alpha, I will tell you the omega. Conscious power has a different form from natural power. Natural power is always integrative. It always integrates, whereas conscious power always differentiates. Always. And in that differentiation, it's not an either or. It's not a differentiation or an integration, but differentiation always co-opts integration and puts it into a subconscious minor mode, so that the composition of conscious form always has a major key, the key of the differential, and a minor key, the key of the previous integration. So in a very peculiar way, musical form is very close to historical development. In fact, in China, the closest that any Chinese ever came to a real history was before Sima Qian, about 100 BC, was Confucius, Confucius. And he always, when he spoke in a teaching mode, used a lute, a Chinese lute. Whenever Confucius taught, he always used the Chinese pentatonic scale in order to deliver the conscious language in an articulated, spaced way. It was not history. Confucius, at his best, produced art. And if one reads the Analects of Confucius, the Lunyue, the Analects of Confucius are a work of art, but they are not a history. And the difference here is phenomenal. A work of art is differential, to be sure, but its differentiality is always subject to the judgment and the formed discursive analytical taste of an individual, of a person, of someone, of the artist. Now, the idea of committee art is a moot point, and you can talk about that later on. But the fundamental, basic distinguishing quality of art, that it's the creative judgment form of an artist, does not apply in history. Because while there may be a historian who writes a history which could be looked at in some ways as a work of art, a history transcends art in this particular sense, and many corollaries following that. A work of art is always objective. It is differentially objective. Now, the concept of a differential objective is very difficult to deal with, so just think of a prism. A prism, to be a prism, diffracts light into a spectrum, or diffracts, to be more precise, diffracts radiation by its lattice structure into an array, a very definite, measurable array, incidentally. The whole purpose of a differential objective form is to permit a measurable spectrum to occur. Though the spectrum may be vast, it is always limited. Though it is very complex usually, it is always measurable to some specific degree. So that a historical process is a differential force, a differential power, having two kinds of power braided together, woven together into a fabric. The energy of individuals, which is energeia in Thucydides' Greek, the dynamic of events, which is dynamis in Thucydides. So energy and dynamic, individuals and events, make this fabric, and this fabric is cut by a form. And the scissors which cut this form out are the differential mode of consciousness in the hands of a historian, of someone, to be sure, but the history always transcends that individual writer. There's no way, even though it may have all kinds of influence, there's no way that a Greek tragedy transcends the author. No matter how much meaning there is to the Oedipus Rex, it is always subject, in our understanding, to the commanding, conscious, artistic formation of the personality of Sophocles. Any understanding of, in this case, the Oedipus Rex, must go for its final confirmation, its judgment, and so forth, back through the prism of Sophocles. Whereas a history is not an objective form in the differential process. History itself is a differential process and does not take objective form. Now, this at first is very puzzling. Do we not have an objective form? Do we not have the damn book? Is it not just so many pages and in translation just such and so and a price? Yes, that's true. But the history of the Peloponnesian War as a work constantly transcends Thucydides. The meaning of the history of the Peloponnesian War is in no way mitigated or indexed by the character and personality of Thucydides. It is characterized and indexed by the history itself. So that we go here to the history, and we learn much more from the history of the Peloponnesian War than Thucydides could ever have known, even though he wrote it. Scholarship, especially in the last 100 years, has pulled out of Thucydides a monstrous treasure trove of understanding of the nature of history, which never could have occurred to Thucydides, never occurred in over 2,400 years. To all kinds, tens of millions of people who read Thucydides. It's true that there were historians like the great Roman historian Tacitus, or the great Arabic historian who wrote the Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun. It's true that Thucydides and Ibn Khaldun came very close to opening up the treasure of Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. The development of Rome and the development of Islam, those two empires, were largely given form by the understanding of the motion of history, the process of history, and the necessity of shaping individuals so that they could handle this kind of energy, and of predetermining events by stacking the deck so that you could handle the dynamic. And in this way, the Roman Empire and the Muslim Empire have lasted for centuries and centuries. In fact, both have lasted down into our own day. All of this was not through understanding Thucydides. All this was through understanding the history of the Peloponnesian War. But since then, in the 20th century, we have learned an enormous amount about history. History and historiography in the 20th century have been neck and neck with physics as the #1 development in man's intellectual horizon. Now, early in the 20th century, just for a digression here, early in the 20th century, one of the greatest imaginative figures who wrote histories, who ever lived, produced a fantastic book called The Decline of the West. His name was Spengler, Oswald Spengler. And Spengler's Decline of the West, when it came out around First World War era, it seemed like it was characterizing a world to the nth degree. But here, this is from the Smith College Studies in History, Peter Geil, from Ranke to Toynbee, 5 lectures on historians and historiographical problems. He writes, when in 1920, Arnold Toynbee first read The Decline of the West by Oswald Spengler, he says he was already revolving these large problems, the large problems of history and events and people. What does it all mean? Where are we? What's happening? By 1920, this was a worldwide issue. What is going on? Where are we going? Who are we? Toynbee's first reaction, he writes, was to wonder whether Spengler's whole inquiry had not been disposed of before even the questions, not to speak of the answers, had fully taken shape in Spengler's mind. They're called presuppositions or predispositions. After a while, however, Toynbee came to the conclusion that at least in the question of the genesis of civilizations, Spengler was most unilluminatingly dogmatic and deterministic, and that there was some room for an English empiricism to make a try where the German a priori method drew blank. So Toynbee sat down not to write a history, but to look at history as a subject of inquiry. He wrote a history of histories. And his work, in about 12 volumes, is called A Study of History. It's a meta-history. It's a history of histories on a grand scale. But in order to write his study of history, his history of histories, he had to have formal themes that could be worked with in some conclusive way. Instead of relying upon imagination, which is a mythic mode, relying upon imagination to develop form is a cultural predisposition. It's a mythic pre-calculation. It's extremely viable on the tribal level. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the differential dimensions of the real, where consciousness is in play. Nothing whatsoever. Where imagination is very healthful in the tribe, in the culture, on the mythic level, imagination is very healthful, necessary. It counterproduces in consciousness. Imagination counterproduces and produces what is best characterized as fantasizations. And the fantasizations, in order to have some kind of grounding, always regressively go back to the ritual level. So one has to transform imagination. But that whole issue, that whole problem, that whole task of transforming imagination doesn't even occur until one has dealt with some of the problems in history. Toynbee came up with a central theme in a study of history. His central theme was that there is a pair of forces. He was, instead of using Thucydides, individuals and events, Toynbee used challenge and response, because he was writing an abstract history, a meta-history, a history of histories. Instead of using what had become the characteristic themes of history, persons and events, whereas John Dewey wrote characters and events. Characters and events have to do with history. But a history of histories must look at an abstract quality that runs throughout many histories, and Toynbee found that challenge and response were the working pair. And on this basis, a study of history developed this grand theme. I'll return to this next week and in some of the following weeks. But the point, or a series of points, are these. History is a conscious power. If you try to handle a conscious power bare-handed, you will be electrocuted. Conscious power does not come with natural precautions added. It's not a batteries included kind of a deal. In nature, because nature always prepares forms in a natural way, whatever power there is in nature is always within forms that can be handled naturally. But conscious energy is supernatural. It's not limited to, nor is it referentially binded by nature. It transcends. It abstracts. Like Ariel, it's gone with a whistle so high that you couldn't even follow it. So you cannot bare-handedly handle conscious power. If you try to handle consciousness bare-handed, you will be indeed, as the phrase with bitter grape grimaces used to go, you will be fodder for the gods. The whole import of the form of Greek tragedy is that once human beings have added the conscious dimension to their lives, they can no longer work in a simple cultural mythic mode. Because now the myths, instead of supporting you, work against you. Everything that helped you now is a resistance stopping you. In a way, it's almost as if consciousness is a transgression against nature. It is not a transgression against nature, but on the mythic level, those cultural forms act as if it were. The individual who becomes conscious in a tribe is an outsider and is shunned. You're no longer a part of the people. You're no longer a part of the tribes. In Genesis, when Joseph, through his ability to vision, became distinctly different from his 11 other brothers, those brothers sold him into slavery into Egypt. Get rid of him. He's no longer one of us. He's no longer one of the 12 sons of Jacob. We don't know what he is. He's a mutant. He's an alien. He sees in ways which we cannot see. He sees things we cannot see. He sees processes that are beyond us. If we permit him to stay, everything that we know and trust and are secure with will be unraveled. Sell him. And Joseph is the first of the great visionary figures in Genesis. Abraham is not a visionary. Jacob is not a visionary. Joseph. A history always has, then, conscious energy, which is lethal if not handled in the right way. What's the way to handle it? Not to grasp it, but to hold forms that are open to allow it to course through. If you try to grab energy and dynamics on the conscious level with an integration mode, with integration forms, that's prescription ready-made for disease, for death, for poisoning. It's like the meridian system in Chinese medicine in the body. Any obstruction anywhere backs up energy. The meridians do not exist in nature. They're not there. You can go into the body to any degree, to the molecular level, to the atomic level. There are no meridians because they do not exist in nature. The meridians do, however, exist as quite an objective form in conscious differential power. There they are real. And because the differential is a higher power, it's the other world, it's a higher world. And because they're real in consciousness, consciousness lays its stamp upon nature. And nature will flow in those ways. Anything that backs up by trying to objectify it in a graspable way results in backed up energy, in illness, in disease, in death. You're courting disaster. So that the hands of differential consciousness are always open. When you see someone saying power to the people with a grasped fist, that's poison. It's patently poison. It's Gila monster time. Power to the people, the ancient prayer mode where the hands are raised open. No guns. But one can handle conscious energy. One can handle differential forms and thus differential processes. So that a history process is tremendously powerful, but the individual has a capacity to handle that energy because the individual has come out of a similar differential power, has come out of vision. Because the individual has already, they wouldn't be individual if they have not already become prismatic of the processes of vision. So that for a history to handle historical power, one has to have had experience handling visionary power first. The saying is very clear, although no one hears it anymore. Everyone's got wax in their ear. The saying in St. John is very clear. Without vision, the people perish. As long as the people remain on the tribal level, on the cultural level, they don't need to have vision. Myth will be more than enough to keep them healthy. But as soon as that people begin to add conscious dimension to their lives and their events, then vision is indispensable. And as soon as they begin to achieve individuality, that calls forth, because history as a resonance happens because of individuals and events. So one has to learn then how to deal with this. There's another ocean. The ocean of tidal waves. The mythic level is rough seas. The ocean in history is tidal waves, tsunami. The seas don't have to be rough all the time. It's just one set of waves. If you don't deal with it, that's it. You're out. You lose. So history, as an ocean of differential consciousness, has to be handled in a very wise way. And the way in which to begin to handle it is indicated by Thucydides in his History of the Peloponnesian War. That the kinesis, the movement, is a movement which is delimited by the influence of individuals and events. No matter how complex it is, it has those delimiting qualities. Now, you can't know all of the individuals, but you can do a process. It's famous in physics as the Gauss elimination. You take a confused, complex situation. You take a complexity, and you take one variable out of it, and you run this single variable through the complexity, and by understanding how this one variable works, you are then able to subtract that variable from the complexity so that the resulting complexity is reduced in its stymieing largeness by factor of one variable. And because this is a method, because it's a conscious method, it can be repeated. So you can take a second variable and you can run it through. And a third, all the time reducing this monstrous complexity to something manageable. You may not get it down to zero, but you get it down to a level, a dull roar it's sometimes called, to where you can deal with it. Now there are two variables that can be handled in history. One are individuals, one at a time, and the other are events, one at a time. So in a history, in a sequence, in a kinesis that has a definite starting point and a definite end, you want to be able to take one individual and just stick with that individual and follow that thread, that sinuous thread all the way through. Or you want to take some event in that sequence and find how it functions within that development. Now, individuals are important because they follow through. They're like the kind of thread that goes all the way through. Events have a different kind of importance in that they give you a complete cross-section at any one point. An event variable analysis is like a cross-section photograph. It's like a slice through the tree. It gives you all the tree rings so that you can see what the whole pattern is at some moment. But with an individual, you follow the entire movement, the entire kinesis from beginning to end. Now, in Thucydides, in the history of the Peloponnesian War, he favors the events first. He starts off with the events. He starts narrating the events, how this, that, and the other occurred. But as he comes into Book 2, where he goes to the exact beginning of the war, no longer just the general events, but the exact event, the true beginning of the war, he immediately then shifts to an individual. And the first individual variable that Thucydides uses in his history is the greatest figure in the whole history, the figure of Pericles. Pericles is the first individual delineated by Thucydides. He's the first variable. And though Thucydides lets us know that Pericles died very early in the war, the personality of Pericles was paramount in the whole history of the war, even though he only lived about 3 years into the war and then died. But the effect of the personality of Pericles was one of the major structures of the history of the Peloponnesian War. And Pericles in Thucydides is one of the all-time great conscious figures. It's not that Pericles is so conscious, though he was, but it's that Thucydides' Pericles is extremely conscious form. One comes to understand for perhaps the very first time the incredible, startling vicissitudes of human personality and the weird way in which those resonances affect events even after they're dead. And that once one knows the character of, in this case, Thucydides, one can follow this variable all the way through the history and see what a monstrously huge section of the complexity is wrapped up in that man. The man who built the Parthenon. The man who made Athens, Athens. Because it's the whole, can I use some Hollywood language? It's the whole PR scam of Athens, of the Parthenon being the cream of the world and everyone else being second-raters. That was one of the major triggers for the fear of Sparta and all the rest of Greece, to get these guys before they cement us in. Take them out before they do us in. And Thucydides says, understanding human nature in the way that I do, this kind of event, this kind of dynamic is going to happen again and again and again. Because when you have the capacities of an economic power like the Athenian League was, they had enough power. They decided in the first levy to build 500 extra ships just to keep tabs on the Spartans. Can you imagine 2,500 years ago, the economic power just to build 500 extra ships just for that? Tremendous wealth. People, Sparta was a village. They didn't have any boats at all. Can you understand? It's like Paterson, New Jersey versus New York City. Hey, we got a waterfall at a bridge. Big deal. Thucydides shows that the personality of Pericles made this image stick so that people believed it. It wasn't true while Pericles was alive, but as the Peloponnesian War went on, it became more and more, quote, true. It had devastating effects as it sank in what this imagery really meant. More and more people took one side or the other. The event that Pericles initiated making classical Athens in the symbol of the Parthenon the power and pride of the world, the glory of all time. People sorted themselves out pro and con without any gray area in between. And before the Peloponnesian War was over, everyone had taken a side one way or the other. Even the barbarians, even the non-Greeks. Even those people that came centuries later, like the Romans, they took the side of Pericles. Pericles couldn't do it with his Athens, but we will do it with our Rome. The Parthenon didn't work, but the Roman Forum sure as hell will. Well, the Greeks couldn't do it, the Romans couldn't do it, but the German people will do it. And the Reichstag will last 1,000 years. Do you understand? Thucydides is saying, once conscious forms are made, they don't go away. They're not biodegradable. Nature doesn't dissolve them. They're there, and you have to deal with them consciously. And if you don't deal with them consciously, they will deal with you. One of the most famous sayings of all time, the American philosopher George Santayana wrote, "Those who do not remember history are condemned to repeat it." Let's take a break. Perhaps the greatest testimony to the power of Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War, to frame the really important issues of consciousness, is that immediately following Thucydides, you have the dialogues of Plato. So the very first response in classical Greece to what Dr. Thucydides said is a problem is the prescriptions of Plato. In Plato's dialogues, you find, and they're called dialogues, they're conversations between people. And usually it's just a few people. And archetypally it's two people. And one of the two people is always Socrates. Now, if you can follow me for one more minute, you'll learn something really powerful. Not because I know it, but because it just is. We talked about how complexity, no matter how complex it is, and differential forms and processes are, how complex are they? They are infinitely complex, seemingly, until given form. Then they are just enormously complex. But the whole process is to take one variable and learn how it runs through this complexity, and that reduces that complexity by the index of that variable having been understood. Plato's dialogues take famous, complex issues and take the variable of the individuality of Socrates out of the complexity, so that for the very first time you find somebody who paid attention to a history and learned how to begin to consciously deal with the differential nightmare that had descended upon the Greeks. It's not obvious at all. That nightmare that descended upon the Greeks descended upon the Romans also. The Roman Republic ended in a very long, protracted civil war, the final victor of whom was Augustus. The philosophic digestion of the Roman crisis did not come until almost 300 years later with Plotinus. And it was Plotinus teaching in Rome who caused everyone to remember Plato's solutions of the conscious differential nightmare problems of the Greeks and proposed Neoplatonic solutions to the problems of the world of his day. Let's come to Benjamin Franklin for a moment. The modern historical complexity is so complex that it almost baffles characterization. The true situation of 1995 is a nightmare so vast that one could hardly even expect to wake up from it to anything else. But it is only, I use the term advisedly, it is only a historical net that we are caught in. It has nothing to do with the evil of man, has nothing to do with the fracturing of nature, has nothing to do with inability of mind to realize. Nothing at all. It's simply a historical process that has never been consciously handled in the last 50 years completely, and in the last 120 years almost exclusively. But there was a time when it was handled with consummate individuality and complete handling of events. And the individual who handled the complexity of modern historical process with consummate artistry was Benjamin Franklin. And while Benjamin Franklin handled it for himself, he was able to teach this to several other individuals, like Jefferson and Madison, so that they were able to make forms, very large forms, to handle historical process fairly well. And it was handled fairly well, until the complexity simply outdistanced the utilization of the forms that were made. So we use Benjamin Franklin as a pair to Thucydides. And they're not just paired like railroad tracks, but they're paired in this sense that Benjamin Franklin, is an angle of vision into Thucydides' history. Benjamin Franklin as an individual is extremely conscious, one of the most conscious individuals who's ever lived. Benjamin Franklin, in many ways, is an American Socrates. And in many ways, Thomas Jefferson is an American Plato. Now, the quality of Benjamin Franklin, the quality of his individuality, of his person, is knowable almost to any degree of specificity and acquaintance, not simply due to modern scholarship, but due to Franklin himself, because his autobiography is masterful. Now, his autobiography is not what we would call an artistic form. It would be difficult to make a case that it's a work of art. But as an example of a history, it's one of the world's greatest documents. It is a far more conscious document, for instance, than Augustine's Confessions which is one of the world's greatest autobiographies. It is, in fact, even more conscious than Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, which are extremely conscious. But Franklin's autobiography is one of the world's most sophisticated works in terms of presenting, not representing, but presenting a personality dealing with the differential powers of history. Now, what's interesting here is that Franklin's autobiography begins in 1771, when he was 65 years of age. He did not know at the time in 1771, but if you look in retrospect at the historical development, 1771 is a tremendous watershed, because within a couple of years after that, the First Continental Congress is assembled in Philadelphia, Franklin's chosen home base. And it's little wonder that in 1995 Philadelphia, one of the most gorgeous buildings, Independence Hall, should have Benjamin Franklin very prominently displayed there. Benjamin Franklin, in some kind of intuitive, high transcendental conscious sympatheia, began his autobiography exactly at one of the great watersheds of world history. And the longer that he wrote it, the more that events began to disclose to him what a seminal figure he was, paired with the seminal events that were occurring at this focus of world history. So in a very odd way, Franklin and Thucydides both begin writing at what turn out to be the beginnings of world-class events, of histories that forever have changed the nature of life on this planet. The classical Greeks and the American experience have altered the way in which human beings are on this planet, regardless of whatever happens from here on out. Indelibly affected by this. Franklin, on page 1 of his autobiography, says that he is going to use as his theme the circumstances of his life, the circumstances of my life. Now notice that this has a very interesting double reflective quality to it. In Thucydides' history, events and character were like the parallel banks of tracing the theme. The energy and the dynamic, the energeia and the dynamis, the two forms of power that weave together, make the fabric of the theme. For Franklin, the circumstances of my life take the events and make those events subsidiary to the development of the individuality, and yet the individuality is still paired with those events, but now in an introspective way, and in a way which emphasizes a different faculty from imagination. The faculty that's emphasized in Franklin's autobiography is memory. Memory. In Thucydides, memory plays a very subsidiary role. It is there, but it's subsidiary. In Franklin's autobiography, memory is the overarching, paradigmatic, organizing, differential focus. Franklin's autobiography is his memory acting as a Merlin to the King Arthur of his character. It's Franklin's memory who is constantly transforming by selection and by rearrangement, by juxtaposition, by narrative telling, by emphasizing, by de-emphasizing. It is his memory that is giving a shape to this personality in the movement of this particular history, and that the events of this history are nodes within the characterization of this individual. Franklin, in this way, is almost like a superhuman. He's what the classical Greeks would have called a terrestrial hero. A celestial hero does heroic events and then heads up to Valhalla, heads up to Mount Olympus to be with the gods. Whereas a terrestrial hero refuses to go where the gods are and stays where men are, stays to help out. That later became the theme in Asian, high East Asian civilization became the theme of the Bodhisattva, which they got from the West. There were no Bodhisattvas in Asia until there was a Greek Buddhism. Hey, before there was a Tibetan Buddhism, before there was a Japanese Buddhism, before there was a Chinese Buddhism, there was a Greek Buddhism. And the very first human figures in Buddhism are Greek Buddhas. In northwest India, in Gandhara, the very first bodhisattvas are Greeks. They have the classic Greek robes of Periclean Athens, but they have the realized mind of the Buddha. And it became a radical, transformational solution to the dilemmas of history. Because the objective level that is there, quite real, before the person, is not the body in ritual. That is objectively real, and it is before. But there is an objective reality in between the body and the person, and that is the mind. Every other level is objective. Ritual, symbol, art, and science. And once the mind's objectivity achieves an integral form, which is able to sustain itself, the phrase is eternally. Once the mind is eternal, there is no regression. Even if the person collapses, there's no regression back to the ritual level. The mind will be there as a focus. And as long as the mind is an objective focus, as long as the mind holds its form, notice that it's not omnipotent. It's not universal. It definitely has a form. It definitely has an objective focus. As long as the mind is able to maintain that, there's no way that the differential prism of the person could ever collapse. So holding the mind's form eternally, one literally signs a guarantee that the person is, and we have to use the term that's been used for about 2,500 years, is saved. Saved forever. When you put the mind, the realized mind of the Buddha, in a classical Greek body with a differentialized personality, able to handle the conscious energies of history, that alignment, those three in alignment, guarantee that the cosmos will be real. Not a universe which is in natural process forever without any objectivity, but a cosmos which is an infinite form that has objectivity. And literally, heaven is made all at once, forever, guaranteed. This is a tremendous development for beings on this planet. Tremendous achievement. Any planet, any star system, any aeon. But if the integration of mind is not cinched so that the form is real, objectively real, then there will be flaws in the crystalline lattice structure of the prism of the person. And there will come a time, even though it works for a while, that they burn out. They're like a dated filament. They work for a while. And that style of person works for a while. And it might work for a generation. It might work for a couple hundred years. There have been times when a style of person has worked for more than 600-700 years. But they're time dated. The style of personality is time dated. And eventually, the kinesis of the historical process moves in such a way that it finally produces a complexity that begins to outdistance that style of personality. The flaws which were not apparent before now begin to show up. One can no longer handle the challenge. The response is not forthcoming. And slowly one begins to slip. And as that slippage occurs, it shows up not in the body at first, although the body tends to become the basic prescriptive diagnosis of what's wrong, because the body will never lie. The mind does not lie either, and the mind shows up about 150 years before the body gets sick. The mind begins to show the flaws. So one can see the flaws in the mind if one knows how to look. At least 6, 7, 8 generations before it shows up in the bodies of individuals. So when you look around and you see the bodies of people sick, you know that the illness has been there for at least a century and a half already. And that the cure is not to respond to something here and now. The cure is to characterize in memory what this form is and to go back to its beginning and work out the variation so that you can understand how to cure it completely. Because if you just deal symptomatically at the late stage of the body's illness, you're helpless. You're never going to do a thing. You're sitting fodder for failure. It's guaranteed. There's no chance to win. There's no chance even to maintain. There's no chance to even come out with minimum losses. Franklin's autobiography, in a way, is a very radical development of the old Buddha's mind in the classical Greek body. But instead of a Buddha's mind, remember the first Buddha in a personality mode was Greek. So in a way, the Greek bodhisattva ideal and the classical Greek history go together. They form as it were, if I can use this kind of characterization, they form parentheses. The first parentheses is the development of historical form in the classical Greeks of Pericles' day. The second parenthesis is the development of the bodhisattva ideal in Greek Buddhism of the late 1st century of the Common Era, 1st century AD. In between is about 500 years. Now that 500-year cycle is itself a historical energy wave. It was called in esoteric antiquity the cycle of the phoenix. The cycle of the phoenix was first noted in ancient Egypt. I should say in archaic Egypt. Ancient Egypt is dynastic Egypt, and archaic Egypt is before the first dynasty, before 3000 BC. The phenomenon of the cycle of the phoenix goes back at least to the time when the Sahara Desert was verdant, about 12,000 years ago, maybe 15,000 years ago. Now, the place in which historically the cycle of the phoenix is delineated is, surprisingly enough, in the most sober of all Roman historians, Tacitus. And it's Tacitus who equates the cycle of the phoenix with the rise of the Messiah in the Middle East. That the whole messianic vision is tied to cycles of the phoenix. And that the first historical precursor of the return of the phoenix in the 1st century AD was the rise of Pythagoras some 500 years before. And that Pythagoras is a precursor of the Middle Eastern Messiah of the star. But Tacitus, like all great conscious individuals of classical antiquity, understood that this was not a one-time correlation, but that this was a waveform that goes back into the inconceivable past. Now, that particular cycle of 500 years becomes extremely formative when it is brought together with the notion of reciprocity. Reciprocity. Whenever you deal with pairs, reciprocity is always a structural function of the reality of the form in its vibration. Any form that has a paired quality of structure will, when it vibrates, produce a reciprocity, like yin and yang, like positive and negative. That reciprocity means then that the 500-year cycle actually, in vibration, is a 1,000-year cycle, a millennium. And that's how the term millennium, as a large-scale conscious historical form energy, comes into play. A millennium. A millennium is the vibration of a 500-year cycle of the phoenix. Think of a time cycle like a bell, and when you strike it, the struck bell vibrates twice as much as a silent bell. So a historical form, once it's brought into play, is twice the duration, twice the extent, as if it were statically conceived. This is why it's important on the visionary level to have what is called in classical high dharma a living vision. If you don't have a living vision, you misunderstand at least by a factor of 2. And your timing is all off, and you prepare cures before the illness has even set in. And by the time the illness sets in, people have long since forgotten about those cures that were made. So doctors of civilization have to understand living vision and many other things. If they carried around their tools in a black bag, it would have to be the black bag of infinite space. There's so goddamn much. There's so devil much to keep track of. Now, this keeping track of conscious forms is very difficult because conscious forms are always characterized by differential energy. That is to say, they do not stay put. Their nature is not to stay put. Their nature is to constantly enlarge. So that when you're dealing with conscious forms, you have to deal, it's like duck hunting. When you're shooting pheasant, you have to shoot at the pheasant. But when you're duck hunting, you have to shoot ahead of the movement of the duck, because you will never hit the duck. Ducks move like this. And so you have to be able to eye the movement of the duck and see where he's going to be and at which point in the sine wave, at the top or the bottom, and you have to aim there. That's how you go duck hunting. The same thing happens when you're dealing with living form and you're dealing with historical time forms, which in their vibratory capacity are always in this kind of movement, but the movement is not an integral energy, but it's a differential energy. This requires a very, very interesting kind of, the word that we use for it is foresight. Foresight. Pronoesis. Looking ahead. Keeping track of where this will be. It turns out to be indispensable for things like going to other planets. If you're going to go to the moon, you can't shoot your rocket ship at the moon as it is in the sky now. You have to plan ahead. Where is the moon going to be 5 days from now, etc., etc.? And if you're going to another planet, like Mars, you have to figure where in all of the elliptical orbit combinations of the Earth and Mars going to be. And if you're going to another star system, because whole star systems move, well, you can see that the farther you go, the more epicycles you have to keep track of. And as Melville wrote in Moby Dick, you go deep enough so that you see the foot of God on the treadle of existence. Or he says, beware, you merchants who invest your money in ships that hire young, wide-eyed Platonist men who, standing in the crow's nest, get to daydreaming about the motion of the boat, which takes its motion from the motion of the sea, which takes its motion from the motion of the tides of the moon and the earth, which take its motion from the movements of God. And thinking about this on even fine, clear, calm days, they suddenly plunge without a shriek and are swallowed by the sea, never to be seen again. Beware of investing your money in such individuals. There's a quality to understanding the complexity of all of the cycles together, and understanding that as long as they occur within what we call reality, they must be delimited. And that even the infinite has a form. It has the exact form of zero. Even zero must have a form. Now a little digression, but I'll weave it in here. In the India, when the people of India, when the consciousness of India first began on its own native intelligence to learn from the classical Greeks that had Buddha minds about how they functioned, how their conscious mind, their integrated mind, functioning consciously, differentially in this phantom person known as the Bodhisattva, so that they could align themselves with a cosmos. When the native Indian mind understood what had happened, they came up with something which the classical Greeks never came up with. They came up with, in fact, one individual came up with it. Usually seminal ideas come from someone. The man's name was Nagarjuna. Naga means serpent. Arjuna is the hero of the Bhagavad Gita and of also the Mahabharata. He's the archer who can hit anything. When Krishna is testing the veracity of people, he finds that Arjuna is the most specifically accurate of all human beings. In the Mahabharata, the archery teacher Drona, who's teaching the young men, asks them what they see when they pull the arrow, and they describe all the various things, the weather, the sky. Arjuna says he cannot tell what time of day it is or what anything. He's looking at the eye of the stuffed bird that he's to shoot and can only see that. It's the same eye of the eagle that Dante, at the very end of the Paradiso of the Divine Comedy, learns to see only. The eye of the constellation Aquilius, the constellation of the eagle, to see the star that is the eye of the eagle only and to see nothing else, and that when one is accurate to that point, one transcends all of the baffling complexity of the universe and comes through to a conscious comprehension of God's cosmos. It's this kind of quality, it's this kind of character, this kind of accuracy that one finds in Benjamin Franklin. He writes in his autobiography, and I think it's really important for you to get a copy of one of our books, isn't it? It's at least as important as paying for your lesson. Franklin's autobiography, on part 2, page 66, has this most amazing autobiographical revelation. He says, "It was about this time that I conceived the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection." He wanted to be perfect. And he found a plan, he found a method by which he could do it. "I wished to live without committing any fault whatsoever. At any time, I would conquer all that either natural inclination, custom, or company might lead me into. As I knew or thought I knew what was right and wrong, I did not see why I might not always do the one and avoid the other. But I soon found I had undertaken a task of more difficulty than I had imagined. While my care was employed in guarding against one fault, I was often surprised by another. But I soon found habit took the advantage of inattention. Habit takes advantage of our inattention. So that while Arjuna, who was a yogi, could concentrate on one thing only, called in Sanskrit ekagrata, an untrained person, in Buddhism, someone untrained is called a prithajani. It means common. It means you're just one of the gang. A Yogacaran can keep track of one thing and one thing only. And by this way, solve any complexity whatsoever. Come out on the high side every time. Franklin is saying that if you cannot do this, then those aspects that you have consciously delineated that you're not keeping track of, they are open doors by which habit come in and get you. That conscious form, in order to keep track, makes as much danger and peril as it does help. It's as dangerous as it is helpful. So that one needs to be very circumspect. It's like having wishes. You have to watch what you wish for. You have to watch what consciousness styles then as the form that you're going to use for your person to navigate across this ocean of history. Because every aspect of the form that you use must then be conscientiously used at all times. So it's a great mistake to go whole hog, to make a form that you could not reasonably sustain for even a day, much less 100 years. And a lot of the problems of backsliding in this world are because people make too ambitious a form for themselves to deal with the situation. Franklin, in his autobiography, makes a form that has 14 qualities. 13 of them are delineated, and one of them is the whole. The 13 parts is a whole. So he made himself a chart to keep track of all 13 of these qualities. This is the chart for temperance. There was temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, humility. And he thought, if I keep a chart on every day of each of these 13 virtues and every hour of the day, I will eventually gain control over my entire self. And I will have that 14th quality, my personality. So he went at this tooth and claw. And he learned, he said, I concluded at length that the mere speculative conviction that it was to our interest to be completely virtuous was not sufficient to prevent our slipping. Just imagining that you're going to be good is in no way a guarantee that you're going to be good. Just imagining some way in which you can keep track of things and stay afloat is an invitation to disaster if you don't keep it up. So that conscious forms are very precarious. It's like a wish. Once you have wished for something, you can't very well unwish it. So one has to be circumspect in making conscious forms. In nature, the forms always tend towards integration so that the higher powers always include the lower powers. Whereas in differential energy, in consciousness, the higher powers are always transcending the effectiveness of what you did before. So you have to be constantly relearning. And if you're not in a personality which can constantly learn, then you're going to definitely, tragically backslide every single time. Let's say it again. The only differential career that is workable at all, that leads to the cosmos for sure, is to be willing to constantly learn anew. As Shenru Suzuki Roshi gave to the title of his book about 30 years ago in San Francisco, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. If you notice that you cannot come back to a beginner's mind, then that's a sign that mental arthritis has already set in. and that you're not going to be able to respond to the challenges that are most certainly coming. And that those challenges that are coming are of a much more complex nature than challenges you have already faced. Now, to the cultural ego, this is the most fearful of all nightmares. That the further you go, the deeper you're going to get into something that is unhandleable. And so the ego fears consciousness, rightly so. The ego is afraid of consciousness as if it were the worst terrifying phantom there is. And that's good because it needs to fear it. And so clinging to the ego in any way whatsoever is a certain guarantee that consciousness is going to be delimited, it's going to be regressed, and instead of working differentially, one is going to finally get back to a level of just physically patting the body against the abrasions of just even ordinary tribal existence. What Franklin's autobiography, paired with Thucydides' history, delivers to us is a quality where one can begin to realize that these thoughts on history, which are page 33 and 34 in our handout, have a little bit of considered wisdom to them. The first paragraph is just a couple sentences long, 3 sentences long, and it reads like this. Some thoughts on history. With a mythological horizon, one lives within the language forms. The language forms are not contiguous. Here the meaning is content-oriented and feeling-toned. Psychic energy is a stream of conscious flow, a current mode. Whereas in consciousness, one becomes the storyteller, and you function infinitely outside the confines of any story, no matter how large or how complex that story would be. The medium of transformation is the way in which the mind interprets and understands language. So that in very high-powered linguistics, one has to have a transformational syntax in order to talk about ideas that are strong enough to carry differential forms forward. Without a transformational syntax, there is no chance whatsoever. The next week we'll talk about this a little more. I would like you to read an example of historical language, the very first example of a conscious historical language. It's in Thucydides. It's in Book 2, and it, in the Penguin Classics edition, begins on page 143, and it only runs for, I think 15, 20 pages. It's Pericles' funeral oration, one of the greatest examples of this kind of writing in the world. Remember that Pericles is the greatest individual in this history. And his funeral oration is the first archetypal characterization of his personality. What's interesting in Thucydides is that as soon as you have the funeral oration of Pericles, as soon as this quality is introduced into the history, a complementary quality comes into play. A plague breaks out in Athens, carrying away a great number of the young men who would have been able to fight and just killing them. What Thucydides points out is that individuals who are so great, all of their flaws carry over into events. It's like an uncanny synchronicity. And the very first thing that a professional Yogacaran learns is what your flaws are, to see what those flaws are and never to participate in a situation where those flaws could call forth synchronistic destructive events. Now, if you're perfect yogi, you can do anything. But that's very rare. The next best thing you can do is to recognize what your limitations are. And even if a man recognizes his limitations, he can still be a high plains drifter. You can still do a lot of damage. More next week.